Okay, so we are recording, and this is recording number 2. So today's topic, a conversation on the politics and control of schools. And so my first question, Dr. Wagner, why does this topic matter?
Well, I think we all kind of understand on a certain level that the people, how schools will be, what we teach, the decisions on what we teach and how we teach are ultimately going to be controlled by those individuals that are in power-based situations where they can influence those things. And so in terms of control, because it's a public good and schools impact many people, there are a lot of different individuals that want to have a say. And we have a tradition of allowing most of those people to have a say in one way or another. So in education, we're in this world all the time, with different parties sharing their perspectives and trying to shape what we do in schools. And it's really always been that way, and it continues to be that way.
Mhm. So when you say different parties, specifically, who makes the decisions on what is taught in schools and the teaching methods employed in schools? So who makes these decisions, and who are these parties that are influencing those decision makers?
So since the Constitution of the United States does not specify anything to do with schooling or education, it therefore is not considered a federal responsibility and is delegated to the states. So the state legislature will put into legislation, into law, they will propose different aspects of education. So they would have legislation that would talk about what is expected in a broad general sense to be taught to students at various grade levels, and then what is expected of teachers. So they control certification of teachers, licensure of teachers. They also have a lot of legislation. We'll talk about the other things that happen in school, because we already talked about the different purposes of school, and there are so many. So they will talk about the health of the students and the necessity of a school nurse, or the safety of the students and the necessity of certain perspectives and priorities. So all of that comes out. And of course, it's not just the legislature, it's the governor, because the governor signs into law. And many governors, particularly now, will actually form their own agenda on education and then attempt to get the legislature on board. And funding comes from the legislature as well. So that is who has the main responsibility for it. But the tradition in America, because of how schools came about, is that much of that responsibility is delegated to local school districts that are recognized by the state. So there are consolidated school districts, and that's where it's delegated, and it's delegated then to a board of education, who would have some oversight of that. And then I'll just add one thing to it. Most states have created an intersection in between. So in addition to the legislature and the governor, almost every state delegates that responsibility to a board of education, a state board of education, that then has there's a chief education officer in the state, for instance, often called a commissioner. So in New York, where I was for a long time, there's a commissioner of education. And that's the person that they delegate all the oversight to of these functions for the state, in addition to these school districts. So the school districts have to respond to the legislation, but it's the state officer who looks at it on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis. It's not the legislature that is overseeing it. They form the legislation and delegate the oversight of it to this State Department of Education, which is overseen by a state school board.
Right. And so you have your superintendent, who then would be in the middle of the commissioner and then the board.
Well, there are two states that don't have a state school board, Minnesota and Wisconsin. So let's just act like everybody else works the same way.
Uh-huh.
So they, after the legislation is formed, then that's given to the school board to implement, but the school board doesn't actually do that implementation. They're responsible for approving whatever the guidelines and regulations are. They task the commissioner to come up with those things. And then the commissioner has a body of people who work for him, deputy superintendents and all these other things. And that entity is expected to implement the legislation. But because we have local schools in America, we don't have a federal system. Most of the world has a highly centralized system. But because we have local schools, these local schools have a school board and they hire a superintendent. So the State Department of Education, which has been in charge by the state as oversight, they will have oversight over these school districts. But there's a school board there too. So we have so you can see the complication in there. Then in addition to all that, there are groups that are influencers, such as parents, the PTA, or teacher unions, that have some political aspects of influencing these different entities.
Okay. And how does the chief state education officer develop the specific guidelines and regulations? So, okay, am I still frozen?
Yeah, I got the question. You froze briefly, but I got it. So you're asking how the chief education officer of the state develops the regulations and the guidelines. So what's the actual process by where that happens?
Right.
So
Exactly.
that's really important to understand, because our tradition in the United States is to have a lot of local control and to balance all these different people that have a stake in it. So I've been a part of that. So this is the process. So the process would be that the chief education officer, let's just call that person the commissioner, they would task one of their deputy commissioners to form a committee of experts that will draft the regulations and guidelines. And so when I was in Kansas and I was the head of a teacher education program at a school called Newman University in Wichita, Kansas, I was part of one of those. I co-chaired with the dean of the University of Kansas a committee whose job was to define specifically the mandate within the legislation that all teachers that teach in the state of Kansas should have a general knowledge sufficient to teach.
Well, froze. Hold on.
So what does that mean? What does general knowledge mean? So, right.
You're unfrozen now.
Yeah. So what I was saying, when this role that I had, we were co-chairing this committee that had to define specifically what was in the legislation that said all teachers must have a general knowledge sufficient for teaching. So we had to put that into curricular expectations. So that meant science. Well, what kind of science? It meant history. Well, American history? How much history? How much math? And so that's what we did. And it was I and Jerry Bailey, who was the dean at University of Kansas, we represented the higher education entities. And then there were superintendents there were teachers there, the whole different, and a deputy commissioner from the state of Kansas. So we did that. And then when we were done, we had a proposal. Then that proposal went out for comment. And then parents could comment, school districts could comment, teachers could comment. They had regional open meetings where people could comment. And then all that information came back and it was edited. And then it was put into a form that had to go for approval with the State Board of Education. So we have this real tradition. And I did some of that in New York. And I was very involved in terms of the new definition of university in the state of New York.
Oh, we're going to come back to that because that's really interesting. I want to know about
but that's a tradition, and it's cumbersome and it takes time, but it means when you get to the end, the people who have to implement it have had a say, and the people whose children are involved because they're really an important group, they're involved too. So it's
Right.
not being done by the state legislature. So just so you understand, the state legislature, the laws are written very broadly,
Right.
and this whole process defines it down into regulations and guidelines.
Right. And so then teachers, when we look at the curriculum piece of it, it impacts them. But how if teachers or unions have issues with this, what does it look like to say you disagree with something as a teacher, or you disagree with curriculum, or we're going to make revisions? Does that process look very different, or is it something that you just do once every 5 years, 10 years? So how does that look when you want to make a change? And say I'm a classroom teacher and I want to make a change. Does change happen from the bottom, or are there periods of time where from the top they say it's time for us to make a change, and then they get everyone on board? So for example, when we moved from the old standard, say, to like Common Core, like
Right.
how did that happen?
Yeah, so that's a good example. And the answer is it's both, usually up, down, from top down, bottom up. So historically, the states would get involved with it by textbook selection, and some states still do that. So in some states, districts have to choose from 3 or 4 textbooks that were state approved. And in Texas, they actually print their own textbooks. So that was one way they controlled curriculum, was to tell you what was approved and not approved. They didn't get into the methodology in the classroom. So the new wave in education is to look at outcomes. So the movement from input to outcome, from a textbook to an outcome, was in many ways top down, but not top down by the legislature doing it. In some ways it was middle, up and down. So the commissioners and influencers worked in committees to come up with these concepts. Like Common Core is a good example of it. They come up with these concepts, say, we're going to set outcomes for all students, science outcomes, English outcomes. And who was on those committees? Science teachers, science college faculty. They came up with it. And that's how, with experts. And then that was translated up in terms of a broader legislation that mandated that all schools meet the guidelines of whatever it was called in the state. That happened in many states. And it changed the way we taught. It changed the way we taught math, for instance. So math became problem solving, for instance, and things of that nature. The Common Core is a version of that movement to outcomes-based assessment.
Yep, you're frozen. Okay, hold on. You're still frozen. Okay, you're unfrozen now. You're unfrozen.
Yeah. So I don't know where I got lost there, but
you said the Common Core was an example.
Yeah, it's a version of that. But what happened in that, which is another change that's happened over time, is that sometimes the federal government gets involved in these things, and they push mandates out, and they with funding dollars. And so the race to the top is a good example of that, where some states accepted that money and others didn't, and some districts accepted the money. So these initiatives can come from different places, but ultimately our tradition is to have the teachers, through experts on these committees, form those things. And then the listening sessions help them refine it. So you as a teacher your district should have had an opportunity to give feedback on that. Now, who went to give the feedback? Was it the superintendent? Was it curriculum leaders? You know, and generally that's what happens. These things take time to get the input, but the caveat to that is that there's still a lot of district level decision making. So even in these things, districts will decide what the methods are that are being employed, maybe even what tests they're going to use, how they're going to set their curriculum up. It varies from state to state, how centralized it is in the state. But there's a lot of conversation at the district level, and then ultimately, this is the Dewey in me, because I'm a Dewey scholar, is that ultimately the individual teacher has a lot of selection on curriculum and content by the examples you use, by how you set your classroom up, the way in which you lead discussions, the reinforcement activities you choose, so teachers always have a big play in this, regardless of what comes down from whoever.
And what comes down from whoever, and looking at these agendas, what aspect of this do you think is most disruptive in the process?
Well, right now we're experiencing a real wave of state legislature involvement and governor involvement, with a lot of new legislation coming down to school districts. So there's a great NPR spot that you might want to take a look at that was done in February of 2022, and it's called From Slavery to Socialism, Legislators Restrict What Teachers Can Discuss. So it's 40 minutes long, and we can maybe put that up there for people to look at it. But essentially, I'll just summarize it. So in a time frame of a year, from January 2021 to February of 2022, there were 137 bills authored, and many were passed in 35 states that restrict what schools can teach in regards to race, American history and politics, sexual orientation, and gender identity.
Wow.
So these laws, if in the past, using the past perspective, if they were passed, they would be delegated to the State Board of Education, who would then give it to the commissioner, who then would go out and bring in experts and say, okay, so if we are going to change how we teach American history, what does that mean? And how do we teach it? And what should we do or not do? And how do we try to take the idea behind the law and make it reality? And then we'd have listening sessions and all of that. Well, that's not happening in many of these things because they're being rushed into action without that kind of interplay. So a lot of teachers right now are completely bewildered of what they can teach and whether they'll get in trouble with what they can teach. And let me just give you a couple flavors of some of the legislation. So the South Carolina law that prohibits teachers from discussing any topic that creates discomfort, guilt, or anguish on the basis of political beliefs. So how do you teach certain things that might cause someone to feel upset or angry or guilty? So how do you teach slavery to white individuals without a little bit of remorse and guilt? Or anyone, you don't have to be white, who would feel bad about that. As an example, there's also another bill that says that teachers should not discuss controversial contemporary issues. But if they do, they must do it even-handedly and without any level of favoritism. So who's going to determine what's even-handed? And who's going to determine what contemporary issue that might mean? There is an Indiana bill that prohibits teachers from including in their class any anti-American ideologies. But that term is not defined. So what's really common about these laws, if I would pull them apart, and I've read a lot of them directly, is that there's terminology used and to tell teachers you got to refrain from certain things, because it's mostly what you're not supposed to do rather than what you are to do. In the past, most everything was what you were expected to do,
Yeah.
not what you were not supposed to do. So this is a big change there
That's a
too.
big change. Okay.
But there's not any definition. So those laws in the past, that definition would have been produced by a group of experts who are teachers,
Right.
right? These things are really impacting teachers, because right now, as they're preparing for the fall,
Right.
they don't know what to do with these things. So they
Right.
really don't know how do you teach the Holocaust? How do you teach Jim Crow laws? How do you teach slavery? How do you teach the Trail of Tears, or all these kinds of things when when they're all Americans? The Holocaust wasn't an American phenomenon. But how, when people are like that in the world, do you talk about that without creating feelings and emotions, and dealing with the fact that people in government didn't make decisions that were in the best interest of every citizen?
Right. So it's sort of like, so for example, the story of Ruby Bridges, which is a part of some places their curriculum. So you might have that story in the curriculum, but then you have this new bill that says what you can't do. So now you have a teacher who knows that this book is in the curriculum. So it almost seems like, okay, so if I teach this, but I don't understand because it's not clearly defined what I'm not supposed to do, then it just puts me on thin ice so that you could just say, I got you at any moment in time for things that I don't even know what I did, or I don't know how to proceed. So it just seems like it's a trap.
It is. It can be. We don't really know how all this legislation that's out there right now is going to be interpreted in the courts and how it's going to play out.
Right.
But right now, teachers are being expected to make changes with how they teach. And librarians too. I'll tell you another big one, which I actually listened to. I watched a tweet by a Tennessee school teacher who was taping this as she was in on the weekend, cataloging all the books in her classroom library. Because the books in the classroom library, she has to send that to the school librarian, and then the school librarian would look at her list or his list to see whether the book is approved or not approved. Then if the book isn't on the list at all, then those books have to be sent to the state for a decision, to go to some committee that I don't think has even been formed yet.
Right.
So in the meantime, if you don't have an answer on that book, it's not available.
Wow.
And the Sarasota district in Florida, they have suspended all library acquisitions and library donations.
Wait, hold on. Say that again. So what did they do?
So the Sarasota School District in Florida has suspended all library acquisitions and donations until they have sorted out the list of what's acceptable and not acceptable.
So all of these students cannot have access to any books.
No, they're not acquiring any new books. And then the ones they have, they can only give out the ones that they know are acceptable. So yes, it's going to collapse down.
Okay.
That and who has input into that is a whole nother question. If it was a committee of experts, this is what when I saw this is, how do we decide what books are acceptable for students? Well, it has to do with their grade level, their maturity, right? It has to do with how is that connected to a broader topic we might be talking about in the curriculum, right?
Right.
Their reading level.
Right.
Who's going to make those decisions if you're not a teacher?
Right, right. And so the process in New York, I was the parent for my school district for that very committee, where if the school had a book, so this is not what to do, but the what to do.
Yes.
If a book came up and the book was questionable, there was a committee that was all educators. It was the teachers, it was the curriculum director, and always a parent member. I was the parent member. and they would bring the book forth, and we would, they would say, okay, read the book, and we would make a decision. In all of the years that I was on that committee, that never happened, because New York State, the books that are appropriate are the books that are there. So the places that are suggesting this are really suggesting books that are common books that have always been acceptable.
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
so now there is this movement.
Well,
What's
you're
going
right,
on with that?
Michelle, and the other change is that this is being done on a statewide level, not a district level. So this
Right.
idea of local control, which is so much a part of American schools, is now being set aside for a high level of centralized state control. And that's new too, because parents would understand because they trust the teachers in the district. And there's enough other parents who would say, look, no, this, we look at it this way, and my son read it, and he came home and asked me about it, but I never thought about it the way you're thinking about it, and so it evaporates. But if it's done at a state level, it invites in a different level of opportunity. I'll tell you a story that happened to me. So when I left, I was in Kansas, and when I left to come to New York to be president, the State Board of Education in Kansas mandated that evolution be removed from all science instruction.
Wow.
Now, I taught at community college. I remember when I was teaching community college, I was teaching general biology. I had some students say to me, look, I don't believe in evolution. I say, I'm not asking you to believe in it, but you got to understand it. And whether that changes your belief or not, that's not up to me. That's not what I'm talking about. But just tell me you understand it, because it is a lot of biology is based on it. Every college general biology textbook has evolution in it. So every college is going to teach it that way. So therefore, you do a disservice to the students in the state of Kansas if you don't teach it. Well, eventually that didn't happen. It got put back in, but for a year there, that was 2000. So it's not like these things haven't happened in the past, but right now it's the amount that's happening, the veracity behind it, the speed at which it's happening, and the lack of teacher involvement in it. Right. So the State Board of Education actually put that mandate out there, but they didn't implement it right away. They asked for the teachers to get involved and to look at it and everything.
Wow. So as a education leader, as a person who's in the middle of this, how do you even wrap your brain about, okay, so now it's coming down to the school level. And so now as a teacher, you got to try to figure out what to do. And so you have, the ethics of the students need to know this, but then you're told not to do it. So that's a really rough place to be to figure it out.
It's a very rough place to be. So right now in these 35 states that either have laws that have some aspect, and they all vary depending on the actual specific impact point, that's disrupting teachers' ability to have a say in the education of their students and to be the experts. We have people now not relying on the experts because there's this concept that there's indoctrination happening in the schools, and some laws talk specifically about that and others kind of hit it to the side. If you want to really get a sense of what this really looks like, you can go online and pull up Ron DeSantis candidate for governor. So if you went to the Florida governor website, you're not going to see this, but on his page for running for re-election, there is his education agenda. And it has a lot of different things on it, which speak to what's appearing. I have a lawnmower out there right by the house. Okay. It speaks to a lot of the things we're talking about, but I just want to point to one thing that's on here. And there are certain watchwords which we're going to come and talk about. So it talks about rejecting the use of critical race theory in the curriculum. So we'll talk specifically about that. But they're picking up certain catchphrases that speak to a certain body of knowledge or approaches that they're trying to peg as problematic. But here's the one I wanted to just mention.
Mhm.
So he says in here, protect the rights of parents to petition school boards and districts for redress of grievance. Do you know what that means?
Petition, say it again.
Petition, protect the right of parents to petition school boards and district for redress of grievances.
For redress of grievance. So a parent can then go back and readdress a grievance?
Well, I think the difference, the way I see it is, we've been talking about this already. So it's not new for parents to complain,
To the
to
board,
express their opinion,
right,
and districts take, we take that with great seriousness. Same
Right.
thing happens in college and universities. Students come in, parents come in, spouses come in, we listen to it, we try to deal with, we have processes to deal with that. But the
Right.
difference that I see in this is the idea that parents have the right to have a grievance redressed. That's a legal term, which
does that mean?
essentially means that they can claim some harm that was done to their child and
Ah,
hold the teacher and the school accountable. Now, I don't think that's in law
mm,
yet, but this kind of situation bothers me because if it comes out in a parent's bill of rights in education, which is more what I'm afraid of, where those things are codified, and I do believe it's in this way because many of these bills talk about I didn't even know what this word meant exactly,
the
but
woke
it was this
gender identity?
term of woke gender ideology. Now I know what the term woke means because the term woke is a term that goes back to the 40s or 50s, 60s, which meant being woke to the prevalence of racism, right? And in the civil rights movement and in Black Lives Matter, it's a term that's used. But young people today, and millennials, started to use the term woke for anything. In other words, I was woke to my love of this kind of music or self-awareness. But tying it to gender identity and ideology is the issue, where there are many schools that, some of these laws talk to preventing conversations about gender identity in schools.
So
Florida has a law on that.
So the woke gender identity piece is to discourage or to prevent conversations about gender identity.
Right, either conversations, I believe, the way it's written, in the classroom or individually, is the way teachers are responding to it. So for instance, in Florida, their law says you can't do that up through the third grade. And I don't think, I think people would understand you have to be careful about how you have those conversations, and no one's saying that. But it's very specific. So parents could say, if you have a patient bill of rights, that if a student said something to you about anything related to LGBTQ, that you could then, you might get in trouble for that.
Right.
And then if what happens with that student later on decides that they are gay, then
You're not supposed to have a conversation and not address it at all.
now this is not in most states yet.
No.
Florida did pass a law on this, but again, it's a big gray area. Like, what does that mean? Not, does that mean that if a student says, can I even not use those words at all in any context at all? And of course it gets harder as the students get older, but I'm just pointing out that what I see here isn't just the amount of laws that are being passed on how we teach American history, how we teach American politics, how we teach government and civics. It's also who's making the decisions on it, who's drawing up the specifics, and then this idea that might be coming next based on this agenda, of whether or not there's going to be an attempt to put parents in an even more important position. They always are important because it's their child, and I'm not saying that at all. And they have every right to come in and talk about these things, but are they the experts in education? Because historically, as you said, your process would be a group of experts who would then give an opinion on it. And I get the impression that that is being diminished in this new wave. So if I looked at governance and control right now, I am seeing something that I've not seen in a long time, historically, which is state legislatures getting involved in particulars.
Right.
And not giving the chance for the various influencer groups to bring to bear. Certainly some of these things will be sorted out in the courts. We'll just have to see, but this does speak to the impact of not the impact, but the way in which we arrive at education policy and regulations. How if some piece of it starts to use that lever of power in ways they have not historically, what it can mean. And we know that, we had states before that had schools that were under-resourced and separate schools for separate races.
Right.
The curriculum was highly controlled.
Right.
Many things weren't taught.
Right.
And we've changed from that. And this has the potential to upend a lot of what we have put in place in terms of the social study curriculum, the way in which we teach history. That's why I use evolution as an example. That is also the way in which we teach science. All of these different curriculum areas could be impacted if this change in how we make decisions actually starts to become very common.
Yes. The legislation and the tone of the legislation and the grayness of it just creates possibilities for decisions that are not educationally or ethically sound because of the process, the rush, and the tone. And I think the word is YRSA. It's sort of like taking over the practices that we already have that are sound. So as you said, there are mechanisms for all of the things that you've said, but now all of a sudden we got a new bill to kind of take the control and put it in the hand of parents. And it's not even the majority, a small group that might have a common ideology. And so the minority ideology then becomes the majority. That's scary.
You said that very well, Michelle, because the past process gave a lot of people input, and then all that input was taken into consideration and middle ground was found. This is not the case here. And so this really comes down to how districts are drawn and all those kinds of things, much more than what the people in general would think about it. These things are impacting college and universities too in different ways. So already, but they really only have an opportunity to impact public universities. The private universities have been exempt from most of this in many states. But for instance, in Florida, there is the survey that has to be done of college students in terms of their ideology, and then there has to be a match to that in terms of who's on campus. And it's also clear in the law that's just been implemented that colleges cannot restrict student access to varying ideologies on their campus. So just to give you a flavor, on the past, colleges would not allow a neo-Nazi person to come on their campus, or the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan to come and speak on their campus. But under that law, can a public university exclude that person if a faculty member invited that person to campus?
Right.
So that is very interesting to me.
Mm.
The colleges cannot look to maintain civil discourse. There already are a lot of laws now that at places like Texas and Florida, the public universities can't exclude firearms on campus.
Right.
Now,
I've had some professors at University of Kansas, stories about students carrying guns on campus.
Yeah.
And it's a whole culture, and the gun is there, and they
Yeah.
actually have to address it, and preserve and respect their rights, to carry a weapon.
I just use that as an example because those decisions historically would have been done at the university level. So it's the same kind of thing where individual universities, that power is being taken away from them to look at their own environment and what makes sense, and who can come on campus. And these are all issues of safety usually and things of that nature, like who comes on campus to speak or not speak. College universities are very open in terms of who comes on campus to speak. Private institutions that are church related, they make their own decisions and they still can. But it'll be interesting to see how some of these things play out at the university level too. But I don't expect it to be the same way because we're dealing with adults, so we don't have to deal with parental impressions. But I'm sure there will be some kinds of pressures that will come on in a separate sort of way as well.
Well, I think that some groups hope, because I did meet with a parent group one time that expressed to me how unfortunate it was that they sent their children to college, and they came home with all these ideas and beliefs that the family did not have.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's like, but that's the goal. And they're like, they fill their heads with all of this stuff and these ideas, and they come home. And so it's sort of like, that's the transformational piece that is so important in our country's history. And so I think there's an attack to take that away, because you're from a conservative home, you leave conservative, I want you to come back conservative. I don't want you to be transformed.
Well, no, what I find interesting about that, and I understand that's very real, Michelle, but in the age we live in today, this device changes everything. You cannot do what we used to be able to do 30 years ago and try to create a very isolated environment. Young people today, they can find out so many things so early. We can't control that in higher education. If I was teaching something, I teach history of modern Japan, right? And in history of modern Japan, we deal with some really tough issues. So if the students really wanted to, if I decided not to talk about the rape of Nanking or genocide by the Japanese against the Chinese, some of the students would figure it out anyway, and they find it.
Right.
And they see all of the very disturbing video that exists of that. So I can't stop them from finding that, even if I wanted to.
Right.
And that's the problem. And you can, as a parent, say to your child, well, I'm not going to give you a phone.
Right.
Yeah. How long will that last? The minute they're 18?
Exactly.
So I just think we live in a world now where there are some people who really want it to be the way it used to be, and you can control the pathway to ideas. So, but schools are fundamentally, college and universities, K through 12, K through 16, we're a place where we have to teach students how to think and reason and evaluate, and have to have a moral background underneath it to make those decisions. And that's what we should be spending our time talking about, is the latter one. Do universities and colleges, do we attend to those common values that we want students to learn so that they can make good decisions? And if we just don't talk about them, then how are they going to learn those? And they won't, and maybe they'll learn them from their parents, but maybe they won't.
They won't. But speaking of university, you alluded to earlier about the college becoming a university or the process. So just since you were such a part of that, what is the difference between college and university?
Well, that definition has changed over time. So today, every state would define a university. Just put it this way: most states don't make it. They don't have any description of that. So when I was in Kansas, we could choose to call ourselves a university or college, and the state did not weigh in on that at all.
Okay.
But in New York had a very restrictive definition that said university meant that you had to have 3 doctoral programs in research disciplines. So that meant that a degree that a doctorate that led to a certification didn't count. So you could have a medical school, didn't count, a law school didn't count, doctor of nurse practice didn't count, doctor of pharmacy didn't count, so forth. You had to have a research discipline. And even in EDD, they decided at some institutions, it really was a more practice degree, so it didn't count either. So every other state had a different definition. Massachusetts was the last state that changed it, and they said basically you had to have a diversity of graduate programs, not doctoral programs. So the common definition of a university is an institution that has some graduate programs, I would say, is a common definition. But I would have people come, like on an accrediting team, and they go, "Oh, I didn't know you had doctorates. I didn't even know you had graduate programs. Why are you at college?" And I'd say, well, that's the definition here in New York. And it was problematic because in some countries, the term college means secondary school.
Right.
So if you were trying to, recruit international students, it was a disadvantage, and it wasn't really descriptive. But it was difficult to change. I spent a lot of time, particularly when after I finished as president of the college, I did a gig as the interim president of the Independent College Association in New York. So I lobbied hard the Board of Regents. So we don't call it a state board of education. We have a Board of Regents that oversees the regulations and guidelines. So they were over that, and I met with them, and because it was the pandemic, they would come on a Zoom call, and I was able to tell these stories like I'm telling you. And I think it really changed their point of view such that they changed the definition. So it just means you have to have a diversity of master's level programs. But the term university has changed a lot. It's just like a lot of institutions that are 2 years, they don't even call themselves community colleges anymore. Some of them call themselves a college. And so these things have changed. But that was a good example of the process. So I would, for a long time, I worked on this for like 8 years, Michelle. And I get a new commissioner come in, and I work on him, and I go out to dinner with them. And Roger Tillis, who's the regent from Long Island, was really great that way. And get me to dinner with him, and I talk to them about it, and I get them on board, and then they put together a committee. I was on the committee, and then they leave.
Yeah.
We start all over with another commissioner. I did that with 3 commissioners.
Wow.
And so finally, this all happened when there really wasn't a commissioner. And because I had the deputy commissioners on board too. But it's like most things in life, good ideas can happen, but you need people to be open to that.
Right.
And relationships help you accomplish that, it was good to see that happen, because I think that was really important for some of the institutions in New York. But it's a perfect example of how the system works, though. So right now we need
how does the system work? So for future educational leaders, you said relationships are really important. So knowing how the system works and developing relationships with people, would you say is a winning combination?
It absolutely is the way it works. And I would also say that the system works when people are willing to spend their time doing the work. So this system we have right now relies on volunteers. So for instance, I was on the governor's education advisory group. There were like two college presidents, but I got the opportunity to meet the head of teacher recruitment for the school system, the New York City school system, and then I got a whole nother perspective about what they're looking for, why they look for those people, what kind of backgrounds they're looking for, and all those kinds of things. But the people there, like if you're a science teacher, let's say you're a high school science teacher, well, you have to volunteer your time to do this. And it takes time. It takes a lot of time to do it. To be in those conversations, and maybe you go to some of the regional meetings and you listen and you take notes, which is what we often do, so you can hear what people are saying. It relies on participatory democracy to reform our school system. And it's a good model. It's a complicated model. It fails us at times, but teachers are special individuals that are highly trained and highly educated. I'm so tired of the comments that are made about teachers. And I looked this up too, interestingly enough, how are teachers respected across the world? We're kind of in the middle in the United States. And that in of itself is a problem, because if we felt differently about teachers, we would trust them to make the decisions in the classroom.
We would. We absolutely would. So thank you for shedding a lot of light on the politics and control in education. And so as we close this video, are there any comments or closing comments that you would like to make before we end the recording?
No, not really. I know we're going to do our next one. We're going to talk about critical race theory, which is a term that has been misaligned and maligned. And we'll talk about what it really means, because we're going to be asking our students in our class to understand what that term means as a lens to apply. And right now it's a hot point in education, so we'll spend more time on it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks.